Boker Tov, Boker Or. This week's Parsha is Parsha Ki Teitzei. I've entitled it, Why God Sets Boundaries. If I seem a little off, it's because I had surgery on Wednesday, and I'm doing the best I can. This is why I did not record yesterday. I was in terrible pain. So I will do the best I can, and I ask you to bear with me this week. I often find myself in conversations with parents who are presently raising their children and having a difficult time as their children engage in behaviors and involvements which do not meet with their approval. I wonder how much we observe the notion of building a fence around the Torah in our parenting, cast as building a fence around permitted behaviors of our children and preferred behaviors. We all know the adage, it is easier to step back and become more lenient than to step up and become more stringent in child rearing. In this week's Parsha, clearly we see boundaries galore. Of our 613 Mitzvot, Torah Mitzvot, commanded actions, 74 appear in this Parsha, clearly more than in any other weekly portion, and a significant amount of the entire total. Further, it is definitely worth noting that the very title of this Parsha is Ki Teitzei, referring to when we were out and about, outside the confines of our home base, if you will. We will begin with a rather curious idea, that of Isha Yefat Toar, that the man who is fighting for his people and their survival may meet along the way a beautiful woman when he is tired and wearied from battle. We read in chapter 21, Ki Teitzei lemilchama alevecha v'natnu ad Hashem Elokecha b'yadecha v'tzavata sabit. If you go out to war against your enemies, and God delivers that enemy into your hands, and you take captives, V'rayita b'shvi'a Isha Yefat Toar, and you see a beautiful woman amongst them, and you desire her, and you take her for your wife, you must bring her into your home. You shave her head, you let her nails grow. In other words, these were signs of being unkempt, not like today's nail salons. She must take off the garment she is wearing in her captivity. She will remain in your house. You must allow her to mourn for her father and mother for a full month. After that, you may go to her and have marital relations. If you do not desire her, you must divorce her and send her away on her own. You may not sell her for money, nor may you keep her as a bondwoman, since you have afflicted her. In other words, you have taken her as a wife. You are responsible for her. This may seem like a strange place to begin this discussion, but if we look carefully, we see the following elements contained here. A, acknowledgement of human nature and our weaknesses. B, sanction in terms of all that has to be done if a man finds such a woman, kind of mitigating his power position, if you will, and her subservient position by giving him all these requirements that must be met. C, allowing such a woman to mourn her lot, respecting her humanity in the midst of this questionable action. And D, treating her fairly and honorably if one decides to not keep her as a wife. Immediately following a set of circumstances that may indeed challenge our sense of reason and understanding, we learn about having more than one wife, and not unduly favoring the child of one or the other, but maintaining the dignity of all the relationships in the family constellation, even in a social convention that we today may or may not accept. Then there's this. Ki yeli ish ben sarer mareh einenu shomea b'kol aviv b'kol imo v'yisru oto v'lo yishma aleha. If a man has a son who is wayward and rebellious, does not obey his father or his mother, they may chasten him. They must seize him, bring him out to the elders of the city. They must say to the elders, "This is our wayward son." Then all of the men of the city stone him. Once again, we are confronted by a regrettable practice that one hopes that one would never be in a position to enact. It is clearly a stated standard with roles for the mother and father and the adults in the city. In fact, there are very narrow confines for this age of the Ben Saromara, clearly stipulated and specific practices. And of course, there's always the issue of adud, witnessing, witnesses who observe the very narrow range of behaviors, which are confined to gluttony and such related self-destructive behaviors. So A has to be the father and the mother. So if a child grows up, like say with one parent or whatever, then they cannot be a Ben Saramara. all of the city has to be involved, which means that ups the ante in terms of people fighting the idea that this is a ben saramara. There has to be some kind of community agreement and involvement, and that involves the consciousness of the collective. And there's a very narrow range of behaviors here. This is not a matter of calling names or whatever. It's specifically gluttony and drunkenness. In Sanhedrin 71a, we learn as follows. Einu nase ben saramara. You cannot define a child, a boy. And by the way, it's just boys, not girls. And it also has to be in this very narrow time of before kind of puberty and then when they are considered an adult. So the boy is not defined as a stubborn and rebellious son unless he actually participates in gluttony and drunkenness. Sages taught in a Braita, if he ate any other food but did not eat meat, or if he drank any other beverage but not wine, he does not qualify as a ben saramara. So what's happening here is in both cases, we're setting standards that by the standards themselves, they are discouraging the very actions. B, they are blights on the community because these are not things we want to deal with. And C, that the community has a responsibility here. In other words, when we talk about things like peer pressure, or we see that our kids are hanging around the wrong crowd or what have you, we want them in a place with good influences. So this is all about influence of community, excessive self-destructive behaviors on the part of the individual in the case of ben saramara, and kind of an unseemly practice in the case of the Isha Yefat Toar. So in terms of the ben saramara, there's an allusion to the matter in another verse, as it is stated in Mishlei 23:20, be not amongst the wine drinkers, amongst the gluttonous eaters of meat, which is associated with practices of other people that don't engage in humility and in setting of limits. That is to say, a person who is a glutton and a drunkard and sleeps a lot due to his excessive eating and drinking will end up poor and dressed in rags. Rabbi Zera expounds the same verse and says, with regard to anyone who sleeps in the study hall, his Torah shall become tattered. As it is stated, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags. So there are metaphors that are being used here to point us toward desirable behaviors and avoidance of undesirable behaviors. The Mishnah states, Ganav Mishel Aviv, V'achal Birshut Aviv. Let's say he stole something which belonged to his father, and he ate on his father's property, or he stole what belonged to others and ate on the property of others, or he stole what belonged to others and ate on his father's property. He is still not a ben saramara unless he steals what belongs to his father and eats on the property of others. Now, this may seem like an exercise in frustrated linguistics, but it points to a very important aspect of the development of halacha rabbinically. The language of the Torah is taken literally. So like ben saramara, not bat, right? Not daughters, sons. When we talk about kibbud av v'em, there's all question about are daughters required to do the same. When does the gendering of language limit the scope of the teaching? And when does our teaching in its spirit, and this is an Aviva Zornberg question, go above and beyond the limits of the gendering of language in linguistics? We have to be very careful with that, because a lot of times we take things that are written in the Torah and we spin them in a way which is not what the Torah means, or does not fully extend to the spirit of the Torah. That's why we read lo tosif lo tigroa, do not add, do not subtract. We need to try to find and stay as close to the spirit of the Torah as we possibly can. Further, Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says, he does not become a ben saramara unless he steals that which belongs to his father and his mother, because it says aviv ve'imo. The Gemara explains the reasons for these various halachot taught in the Mishnah. And he says that if he stole that which belonged to his father, and ate on his father's property. This is the Ben Saramara. Even though it is accessible to him and it's easy for him to steal, he will not do it because he's afraid that his father will see him, and therefore he will not be drawn to future evil. So in other words, further evil. So I'm sorry, I'm very shaky from the medication right now. So what that's saying is that we must be careful, and we must realize that the midah, the measure of each law, or each corrective, each onesh, each punishment, is very clear and very specific. We cannot run to the market with it, so to speak. We cannot take a verse and say, oh, I know what it means. It means all of this. And so often in our world today, that is exactly what is happening, unfortunately. We continue through the entire Parsha. What we have here is ample warning about many abuses. Rabbi Ari Khan of the OU teaches as follows. Parsha Ki Teitzei discusses a host of abusive behaviors, some sexual and others financial. In general, the Torah legislates against these aberrant behaviors, deeming them illegal according to Torah law. We have no particular difficulty understanding these laws as a whole. The objective of the Torah is always, first, foremost, and always, to create a just, healthy, dignified society. Abusive behavior of any kind would run counter to this objective. We are all too familiar with the various outcomes of abuses. The abuser's compassion becomes dulled, and often there's a downward spiral of self-loathing behaviors. As for the victim, abuse often breeds abuse. We know this. There are studies that show abused children will often become abusers to protect themselves, frankly. The victim becomes the oppressor, perpetuating the cycle, or internalizes the abuses, alternatively, and suffers the destruction of self-esteem that leads to depression or self-abuse. So again, there are very clear and very extensive studies that show that the cost of abuse on the abuser and the abused is significant, and that it does not just disappear into oblivion, but rather leads to further destruction. Oddly, one case seems to break the rule. In a strange and disturbing instance of the female captive, that first mitzvah that I spoke about, taken in battle, the Torah seems to allow the abusive behavior rather than legislating against it. How do we square this? The text does not mince words. This is labeled as abusive behavior. But instead of legislating against having one's way with a woman taken against her will in a time of war, the Torah allows it, but adds one major catch. Your captive must become your spouse. You are now responsible for her. She is now entitled to all the rights and privileges of a spouse. You may not in any way demean her or belittle her or abuse her beyond the actual taking, if you will. It seems that legislation in this case is aimed at limiting the abuse, not preventing it. The Talmudic discussion of this topic further claims to frame and clarify the law, labeling it a concession to the Yetzer Hara, to the evil inclination. This clarification actually makes things even more disturbing. If the sages understood so clearly that the desire to take this woman is evil, should it not have been prohibited, like so many other expressions of man's baser urges and instincts? In the charged atmosphere of the battlefield, the normal standards of decency seem to be suspended. Behaviors even young children know are prohibited, taking things that belong to someone else, using force to the point of violence, even taking lives, become the order of the day in circumstances such as these. The woman on the enemy side becomes vulnerable. They too are most likely to become a part of the war effort, either actively engaged or as a support system for the enemy's forces. Be that as it may, the Torah points out that abusive behavior, even towards this sort of enemy, is not without consequences. A woman taken captive in a time of war becomes a wife and enjoys all the rights and privileges afforded by Torah law. Should her captor turned husband subsequently choose to send her on her way. She is not to be discarded or abandoned. She is not chattel. Rather, she is a free human being. And that is according, again, to Rabbi Ari Cohen of the OU. Here within these somewhat disturbing texts is a most important lesson. There are boundaries. And then when one goes beyond those boundaries, there are other boundaries. In other words, we keep trying to stop the tide of negative behaviors. Boundaries as to what is permitted, boundaries as to what the human being can absorb in terms of captivity and the reality of their failings. Boundaries in terms of how the law can accommodate all of the above. Honest dealings in business, building structures that do not cause any public obstacles, repetition of proper sexual behavior boundaries, paying workers on time, and so many other behaviors that are part of our ongoing daily life are included in the 74 Mitzvot in this Parsha. Here we learn a very important lesson. There is not any behavior or action that is completely secular in the sense of being devoid of God's presence. God is everywhere. God is in everything. God is in every transaction. And God's presence is reaffirmed through the boundaries indicated. Further, these boundaries are critical in ensuring that the Bnei Yisrael behave properly and within the confines of God's given permission, as well as the boundaries that will protect the integrity of every human being who is granted such permission. There are also clear boundaries when we are dealing with those who are enemies, as spelled out in chapter 23. An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, not even the 10th generation, because they did not greet you with bread and water on the way, and when you left Egypt, they hired Bilam, the son of Beor, from Petor in Aram Naharim against you, to curse you. But God transformed the curse into a blessing for you, because God loves you. You shall not despise an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not despise an Egyptian, for you are a sojourner in his land. So this is also very interesting in that these people that abused us, we do not turn around and abuse them. We are held to this standard. Revenge is a big number in terms of not exacting it on other people. Remember back in Vayikra, and you shall love your neighbor, the other as yourself. The other part of that is letakun, you do not take revenge. So when we look at those boundaries of how we are to love, not just because of, but in spite of, and what does that mean? Because people are God's human beings, we do not choose to exact that kind of retribution. Maybe here we're finding another important aspect about boundaries. We went astray in living with some people, and earlier we read about God addressing their responsibility in taking advantage of the Bnei Yisrael. But here we're concerned about our complicity in these involvements. We had a part. We are to maintain distance, perhaps due to our own weaknesses. In other words, is this distance that is indicated here due to the wrongdoing of others, or due to the vulnerability and the weaknesses of the Bnei Yisrael in following the ways of others? And that's what's wrong. I am often, for example, challenged by many in our religiously pitched world regarding my involvement in multi-faith work. Why do you do it? Why do you talk to these people who hate us? What is your purpose? I continue to defend that work and ensure all that, as Rambam, Maimonides, teaches, I know who I am when I walk in the room with my academic colleagues. I know who I am when I am in the room with my multi-faith brothers and sisters in faith. And when I leave, I continue to try to build bridges of understanding because it is more important than ever and more needed than ever. I have never been tempted or swayed in my own practices. If anything, it strengthens my resolve in terms of my most fundamental Jewish teachings to have respect for all people, to love the other as oneself, to always ask for peace before making war, to try to build bridges that connect, not fences that divide. Further, we must be careful, and we're seeing way too much of this in our world today. I'm getting it specifically from one colleague in my multi-faith work, with these global statements that discredit an entire people. But rather, we must balance the distance we keep and the respect we should show for all, for a variety of reasons. So much about this is related to nuance and intentional decision-making, not hating for the sake of hate, and also not yielding to the influence of others. This is how I feel we fulfill our mission of being an Or L'Goyim. Finally, it is this Parsha that ends with what we know as Parsha Zachor. Let us continue these verses. Let us consider these verses of Parak Chaf He 25. Notice how it progresses, and I will read the whole thing in order. You must possess a full and correct weight, a full and correct Ephah measure, in order that you live long on the land that God, your God, is giving you. Be honest in your business practices so that you can live in the land, because you are supposed to be a different people. You are not supposed to cheat or manipulate or do what others do. Whoever does wicked things like this, whoever perpetuates such injustice, this is an abomination to God. And it is at this point that we read, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek b'derech b'tzeitchem miMitzrayim. Remember what the nation of Amalek did to you while you were traveling when you left Egypt. How on the way it attacked you by surprise and mutilated all the weak ones at your rear. You were faint from thirst. Ayef v'yager v'lo yareh Elokim. And they did not fear God when they saw you as vulnerable people. When God, your God, grants you respite from all of your enemies surrounding you in the land that God, your God, has given you to possess. And here are the words. Tamchal et zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim lo tishkach. You must obliterate the remembrance of Amalek from beneath the heaven. You must not forget. Now notice we started with honest measures, honest business dealings, and we devolved to the point where if we don't have respect for what people own, we don't have respect for people either. Notice what this final stated boundary is: honest weights in business. The thinking is that if one is so careful in one's business life and one remembers all that we are supposed to be, this thinking will obtain in other aspects of our life. This is exactly what Amalek did not do. Further, while we remember Amalek, we are to recall the heinous actions towards those who were vulnerable and the lack of honor that was shown to fellow human beings. As I often teach, we are not just to blot out the Amalek in others, but to remember these horrible actions and to blot them out in ourselves as well. These actions, as those of the Canaanim and the Mitzrim back in Shemot, from which we have many repeated reminders in this Parsha, were about no boundaries, about not thinking of the other, about just being concerned with what one wants for their own pleasure. Let's look again at the Isha Yefat Toar. With all of the instructions and the boundaries indicated here, there are clearly deterrents to taking such a woman. But, on the other hand, taking such a woman could be saving her, if we think practically for a moment about all that war is. If this woman, this Isha Yefat Toar, is part of a group of people that practice these abuses, and we take her, and we observe these commandments that show humility and limits and boundaries, and then we take her as our wife, we could potentially be saving her. We as Jews, as Shomrei Mitzvot, are never to live the ascetic life of a hermit. But precisely we are told how to live, Ki Teitzei, when we go out and about. We are part of the world. We must be part of the world. We are to live by the boundaries that we are given so that we can be part of that world in a meaningful and constructive manner. This seems to be what God ordained for us, to live a practical as well as spiritual life within stated boundaries. Just like we want our children as parents to be part of the world, honorably, constructively, and intentionally, while being aware of their place in it and the boundaries that define that place. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for bearing with me this week. Hopefully next week I will be more recovered. Be well all. Lidrat.